was Eric was still on our Slack, and then it was weird.
Yeah. Because Eric is weird. I still didn't respond to his text message.
About what?
I still didn't join his Facebook group.
He sent me a text message. Like, I don't even know what to say to this. Because he's definitely trying to, like... He's trying to enlist me in his... whatever his organization is.
I would just ask him why that. I don't know what his organization is, but I would just say, being my hat.
But I don't really want to talk about it.
You don't want to talk about what?
Whatever it is, like I'm kind of over that shit. Not that I'm not down with his cause or whatever, but like he needs a hobby. Maybe I'm just walking he needs a hobby. Like a real hobby.
Yeah, I don't think that's the problem.
Like you try to get into woodcutting that way. Watch me, I'm going to split all this wood. The real winner in that situation. I go back on that split. Is anybody here yet?
Nope.
No. We have a few on YouTube.
Do you have a list of things to talk about if we don't have questions?
Nope.
You talk about your building blocks for a good intranet. We wanted to do a webinar, right?
So far on their things, I've not seen any videos or pictures of that, which is good. On their,
TikTok?
no, they have like that, you can scan that QR code and go to their picture. Doing.
Oh.
I'll be right back.
I figured you did, but I took it for my own personal ones.
Your own reasons.
Not for those reasons, not to be, not for to look for like Photoshop bounties or anything. I don't know what it is. You have the best computer ball and you waste of time.
Wasted.
I get blue screen death twice.
You gotta figure that crap out.
I want to do it now, but I don't want to.
Caitlin?
We can run seriously.
Just gonna stay back. Respond to Rudolph. Hurry up. Tell him. Get his question in. Most important thing.
There's people waiting in the lobby.
I can't admit that because I'm not in the meeting, because I'm not allowed to be in the meeting, even though I would be in the meeting.
That's true.
This might be too much for me.
Okay. it seems like they don't want help, but I kind of am like, I know better. You guys are gonna need help. But,
Yeah, very much so.
I mean, they're talking about getting a freaking U-Haul, like a big box truck. I'm like, that's cool
Maybe you
and
should
all,
just
but
let them do their thing.
yes, I'm considering it.
I mean, why not? Right, let's, you and Andy step down and do so many things. That's pretty well. You guys could just,
I might.
I'm gonna start with mine. Well, that's everybody's coming. We will see you next time. Nice.
Hey, welcome everyone. We're going to get started here in just a second. While people trickle in, feel free to drop where you're joining us from in chat. And if you want to get kind of ahead of the line and want to drop any questions that you want us to tackle right off the bat, feel free to drop them right in the chat. All right, I'm going to use this time to say welcome to anyone that is new joining us today. If you haven't been here before, just kind of to give you, set the stage for what we do. This happens the first Wednesday of every month. We like to kind of just open our doors to answer any questions about Microsoft 365 or workplace strategy or anything like that, or anything that you might have seen on our YouTube or blogs or all that good stuff. You're more than welcome to just drop them in chat at any point in time. We are streaming to both YouTube and Teams meeting. So for those of you in the Teams meeting, if you'd prefer to come off mute and just chat through your question, you're welcome to do that. Feel free to just raise your hand and we can allow that and kind of we'll prompt the question as they come. But for those of you on YouTube, you just have chat right now. So feel free to drop those in there. Anything else? I will say that we are recording this. We may or may not use it for marketing materials later. But if there's any part of your question or anything that you would prefer to keep not recorded, we're welcome, or we're happy to oblige with that. One challenge I do have for all of you today is in the past, these events have gotten a little bit, I'll say technical, which isn't bad, but with that, there's been a few instances that we've heard of where someone may have a kind of less technical question and they might be kind of lost in the weeds of all the tech and not necessarily feel comfortable asking a non-technical question. So I do want to challenge you, maybe, we'll try this out. For every one question that you have that is very technical, let's lob Matt and Mike here a nice softball, a nice strategy-esque question, or maybe just a higher level question that may encourage those who may not feel comfortable asking a question to do so. So we have a few questions on the Teams meeting that we can get started with. Matt and Mike, I will give you guys the floor, and let's scroll up here. So
Yep.
Aaron has a few questions.
Yep.
No,
I'm going to take the first one from Nicole.
Cool.
And Tanya, we did know that you have a question that you sent in earlier. We'll try to get to that if we can before the end of the hour. But Nicole from Houston, apparently it's pretty hot there. She wants to learn how to create a Power Automate flow that will move a file from one SharePoint library to another SharePoint library to archive. And she wants the flow to trigger based on a button she has set up in the main SharePoint library. So I'm assuming that's like for a selected item, like the automation. I'm going to assume that for now. So yeah, so that's actually something that's not too difficult to do. Let's see.
I'm doing it right now if you
Oh,
want
you
to.
have it?
Yeah.
Oh,
If
sweet.
you want to share my screen, you can. This is it, Mitch. As Mike said, for a selected file, I pointed it at this site with the library, document libraries. So this will happen whenever you're in that library and you click on either automate and then select it, or if you've, it sounds like maybe you've created a custom button, it's going to come in here. You're then going to add a move file action, which SharePoint, then in SharePoint move, there's move file. You can also move a folder if you need to. And then you just need to give it a couple things. The first one is the current site, so the site where it's at, which is going to be the same site as what you had above. The file, and so this is the ID of the file. So you can select it here. You can just like click here, find the thing. But in your case, to make it dynamic, which is what you want, you just give the file identifier. And then you say, I want it to go to this other one. And then you say where you want it to, what folder you want it to be. And I'm just going to say, we're going to put it in shared documents. And then you choose whether or not you want to overwrite it or not. So I would do replace probably, or maybe you could do with the new name, whatever kind of you want to do there. And this should effectively do what you're looking for. There are, just another couple comments, there are some like internal ways to go about doing this as well, but I think this one should work for what you're trying to do. So the next one's...
I want to ask a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty simple flow to create.
Yeah.
And obviously that's very targeted, right? It's going to go to a specific archive location. That would be the reason to do a flow versus telling the users to simply use the move feature of a SharePoint library.
They would have to do a bunch of clicks. Right. Yep. You could use just move, right? Like, so in every SharePoint library, you can click this, choose the move, and then you can move it. The other reason to do it this way is this allows you a little more flexibility about where it goes as well. But
so
yeah.
if you were running under a service account, for example, you could put it in a library that nobody has access to.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
All
right, so next we got a plethora of questions from Aaron. And Nicole, if you have any additional questions on that, feel free to post them and we'll pick those up. But we're going to move on to Aaron. He's got several questions and we're just going to tackle these. So his first question, given my role in the innovation team for a city government, our organization comprises approximately 27 different departments with over 5,000 employees. As a developer, I'm involved in implementing process improvements through the Power Platform. Currently, we're utilizing 3 main environments, dev, test, and prod. I'm contemplating whether it would be beneficial to create an individual environment for each department to facilitate their expanding scope of apps and solutions. Could we share our insights and experiences concerning the strategy? That's actually a really good question. And I'm sure we have a lot to say there.
We do. Do you want to start first, or do you want me to go?
Well, so from our experience, because we've worked with some government agencies in the past, this is not necessarily an easy thing to figure out. But like just to provide some examples of kind of what we've come up with, there's like a few different purposes or primary purposes for creating these environments. Obviously, dev, test, prod makes a lot of sense if you have like a dedicated application that you're building, something that needs its own underlying infrastructure that you don't want it to interfere with anything else, so you would create dedicated environment for that specific solution or app. That would be one reason to do it that way. Another way to think of it is at that agency or that department level, you might create what are called shared environments. And so then everyone in that agency or department would use those environments to do the work that they're doing. So if it's, let's say, the Public Works Department, for example, all Public Works apps, for example, would get deployed into that environment. And then it would be up to you as to whether or not you needed to have dev, test, and prod all three or any combination thereof for a specific agency or department. And then the third area is kind of what you'd call personal automation. And the question there is, should that be done in the default environment, which every organization has out of the box, or should there be a personal automation environment carved out at the agency level? So a place where everybody can do their own flows within the Public Works Department that's not really applications that need to go through the full application lifecycle. So that's kind of
that's kind of the basics, really related to the different environments that you can have. The thing I would say is that there's Microsoft has a significant problem because environments are pretty big and they're expensive to have a lot of them. They're also expensive to manage and maintain, and I think I read ahead a little bit some of your other questions about permissions, which I think we're going to take another question and come back to these because these are pretty extensive questions. But there are other aspects that you need to look at this with. Mike talked about it from an application, the purpose of the application that you're dealing with. So, like he said, I create a dev test prod for an app. That a common scenario for that would be Dynamics. Dynamics pretty much can't live with other things for the most part. It's huge, it's big, it's complicated, and Dynamics is built on the Power Platform. So you're going to create, especially if you have, let's say you have 3 different departments and each of them have a Dynamics installation, you're going to have 3 different environments, 3 different dev test prod environments ideally for each of those Dynamics implementations, right? So that's apps centric, as Mike's mentioned. The shared environment sounds like very much like what you already have, which is like, hey, we have 5,000 people and we've got dev test prod and that's what we got. The individual automation or personal productivity or what, there's lots of different ways to talk about it, is what the default environment was intended to be from Microsoft. But the other threads that you need to apply to that are developer permissions. If I'm a maker or a sysadmin in an environment, I have a lot of access to a lot of stuff. If I have 3 apps in that environment and I as a developer should never have access to this other piece of data, likely you shouldn't have both myself and Mike developing in that same environment for security reasons, right? Because I shouldn't be messing with his app and he shouldn't be messing with my app. There needs to be separation. Another piece of it is DLP policies. So DLP policies are applied by environment, and securing those, especially when you talk about on-premise data gateways or SQL Server access or some of these premium connectors that really need to have some thought put into them, custom connectors, etc. You can look at one environment and one app and say, this app needs a SQL connection to an on-premise gateway. I'm simply not going to let that live with any other app, because from a security perspective, I'm now giving access for every other developer in that environment, potentially, access to this on-premise gateway and to this on-premise data, and I just don't want to allow that potentially, right? The risks are too high for the leakage of data, but it all depends on what you're really doing, right? Having a single environment, having a single dev test prod is simple. It's the simplest way to approach this. There is another option, which is managed environments, which is a little bit like it's a Microsoft way of doing ALM for this stuff. But there are, like we said, there is a multitude of ways to look at this. And the last thing I'll say about it is, it even gets worse if you're talking about actually being in GCC. So you mentioned you're part of a government entity, working on behalf of a government entity. Those entities in the United States can be part of the US GCC, GCC High, and DoD environments, depending on what type of environment there are. The features, capabilities, and functionality for each of those environments are very different than the standard traditional tenants. And so, for example, you said you're using dev test prod. Depending on what you're doing, you could just use dev environments, but dev environments aren't available in GCC because they rely on trial licenses, which isn't something that's Microsoft currently supports in GCC environments. There's a lot of stuff going on there, but that would be the other thread, is whether or not you're in GCC or not. The only other thing I would give you is an example of what we've done in the past. So for a very, very large entity, they're basically breaking out each divisions, effectively, environments into and categorizing them separately. They have dedicated people that are managing or responsible for managing those environments. And each application, by default, every application is getting its own environment, a dev, test, prod. And the developers only have access to dev. If they want to push anything up, they would have to use the ALM process to push between them. That is like gold standard, like best practice that you could do. It's also the most expensive from a management, maintenance perspective. So you don't have to do it that way, but that is an example of a high level implementation.
Cool. Do we want to tackle the next question about permissions? Before we move on,
I would say let's move on. Let's move on and come back.
Okay.
Let's go to Eric.
Yeah.
Next.
So I'm having issues with grant access for item level permissions with Power Automate. The flow owner has owner permissions of the list. So the flow owner has owner permissions of the list, but I still get errors when an item permissions are changed using stop sharing item. Should I expect flow to be able to update an item in SharePoint list after its stop sharing was implemented? It depends on what they did when they stopped sharing. So unless a user is a site collection admin, you can remove their permissions. So if you're an owner of a site, that doesn't mean that I can't, as someone who has access to change permissions on a item, can't go in, stop sharing the item, modify the permissions, remove you from those permissions, and then that user will no longer have access. In that scenario, you'll have errors because you don't have access to that item. A good way to check on that, which actually a good way to kind of assess what's going on there would be to come into the list or library. So if I go into site contents, and let's just go to site pages, because I think I got some stuff in here. And I go in and I do manage access, and I go advanced, which brings you to the lovely classic experience. I can click this button called check permissions, and I can enter a user.
So you would enter your service account.
You would enter your account, whatever account you're saying, hey,
account.
that owner account, and you would click check access. So this says for me, I have full control given by the Contoso onboarding owners group. So this will tell me what's going on with that user, and you can tell whether or not that user has been removed. And for example, if I click stop inheriting permissions and I remove this owner access, unless I'm a site collection admin, I no longer have access to this item. So another alternative would be whatever account you're using for that flow. If that user is a site collection admin, then you won't have this problem ever. Last thing I'll say about it is you use the term flow owner. That actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who the flow owner is. What matters is what the connections user is. So just because you're the owner, I can have a flow that I own, but I had Mike create me a connection because I shared the connection with him, and he's the one that created this connection. So then he would be the one.
Or you've shared the flow with run-only users.
Or yeah, correct.
Right.
Or run-only users,
Right.
or like there's a bunch of other scenarios that can cause this same kind of problem. But based on how you described it, my assumption is you created a flow, it's running under the owner's context, the connection is the owner, and that's what you're having the problem with. But as Mike said, if you're doing run-only users, it could be running under the context of the person who ran the action, and that user doesn't have permission to the item. Like that could be what's going on. It really depends on what you're doing. But those are a couple things I would try to check out.
Cool. Good question.
Let's try to close out Nicole's question here. She's setting it up, but she's wondering if how she can actually trigger the flow that you were talking about.
Okay, it's from the button.
Yeah.
So I'd have to go look it up a little bit. There's an article I can probably find quick. But basically,
you come back to that.
Okay.
Mike, let's go to Jason's question on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
Ooh, strategy question. All right. Looking for suggestions on ALM strategy for someone just starting out with Power Platform with a single developer. So that's a good question. So there's also a follow-up question. what solution strategies would we suggest? Should it be separating solutions based on component type to mitigate cross dependencies? Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's two parts to that, one being the ALM part, and then the other being like how do you structure your solution? So from an ALM standpoint, a couple things you probably want to sort out, and with a single developer it may or may not be as important, but I think that a couple goals or things that you might want to accomplish with ALM, one would be source control, right? So the idea is I make a change to something inside of the Power Platform, and that change gets synced to source control somewhere. That has value because then your source control is stored somewhere. If your environment ever blows up, you have it somewhere. For a single developer, it's less important to have source control because you're not trying to merge code with somebody else. So that would be one of the reasons there. And then the other purpose for an ALM strategy, even for a single developer, would be utilizing the pipelines, let's say in Azure DevOps, so that you can actually push from one environment to the next. And so let's say you want to have somebody actually validate your change in a test environment before it actually goes to production. So that would be a reason to use ALM in that world. And there is an ALM accelerator out there that is kind of a template example, and we actually have a video on that that you can kind of walk through and see how that actually works. But that is only a template, so you would want to take that, and assuming, like if you're pretty vanilla in what you're doing, you could probably apply it pretty directly. Otherwise, you can adapt it if you know what you're doing to suit your needs in your environment. On the other front, on the solution strategies front, there are a number of things that I would kind of point you at. And some of this is from my own learning experience, but one of the things, for example, in a solution, let's say you're building a full Dataverse solution, so you have tables and business rules and forms and views and all of that good stuff, along with maybe some other custom components or Power BI dashboards or reports. Like there can be any number of things in there. One of the things that I like to do is I like to have all of the core data tables for my solution in a single solution. And so that'll be tables, forms, views, business rules, some of those basic things that go there. I generally speaking always like to have that in a single solution. And then the question is, what other solutions should I build separate from that would be dependent on those tables? And so you might think of things like any custom controls that you need to build. So if you're building PCF controls, those would be in separate solutions. You could potentially do things like put all of your flows in a separate solution, so all of your automation. That might make sense to be in a separate solution. You might also put reporting components like Power BI reports or data sets in a separate solution. So that would be kind of a way to look at it. And then the other thing that would probably be in your your primary solution will be if you have a model-driven app. With that, I would probably include it there as well. But if you separate those solutions, what that gives you the ability to do is you can leave your main solution intact, make some changes to your flows, your automations, and then deploy that over the top. And it makes it a little bit easier and faster to deploy those individual pieces. Now, the other thing I'll tell you is there's two primary ways to deploy. One is basically an update. So if you use the update method, which is I don't believe it's the default method used in the UI, for example, it will just overwrite what you have and it won't clean up anything that you've removed. So if you had a table in version 1 of your solution and you decided to remove it in version 2 and you do the update method, it will not remove that table when you deploy version 2. The other option is an actual upgrade, and the upgrade method will actually do the work to remove that table in version 2 when you deploy it to the target environment. So that's an important distinction. So if you care about when you're deploying to test and prod, for example, keeping those environments clean and free of a bunch of extra stuff, using the upgrade method is kind of what I would suggest there. I don't know, Matt, if you have any other...
I would break it, like you can go for 2 days about ALM and the Power Platform and what it means. The things that I would tell you is, if you have licensing for it, managed environments can help you. So that to do that, but to be clear, that managed environments requires you to have, and managed pipelines require you to have licensing for all users that are going to be in the production environment that's tied to this other environment. I would always have a dev test prod. Your development environment, if you're the only developer, you can use a free developer environment, assuming you're not in GCC. You know, I would always use solutions. Mike talked about the various iterations of that. I would do a solution per app at a bare minimum. If you have things that are core that would be shared across apps, you definitely have to have a kind of a common solution. The moment you started using Dataverse, I would absolutely consider having separate environments for the apps, because there's a risk that two people could try to use the same Dataverse table and customize it and walk all over each other and cause problems.
When you say two people, you mean two different
teams of developers,
right, yeah.
or the same developer who just didn't think. You know, I worked on this app 4 years ago and I didn't remember that it uses the activity table, and I customized the activity table, which broke this other app that I didn't think about.
Yep.
Right?
Oh yeah. So another thing, as you're developing in that world, if you're customizing some of the out-of-the-box tables, like there's a whole lot of functionality, because as we've mentioned, Dynamics is based on Power Platform Dataverse stuff, right? So if you go in there and you monkey with, let's say, the task entity or a phone call or email or some of these built-in things, right? They have a bunch of stuff that just works out of the box the way that it works. And you can go in there and make a change and not realize that you actually tore something down that you didn't want to tear down. And I've done that a few times. And the remedy for that is to just be aware that in any Power Platform environment, you have basically automatic backups that are happening like every hour, and you have up to 7 days of those, unless you configure it differently. And so if you find yourself in a situation and you catch it within that 7-day period, you can go back and restore to a previous point and get back to where you were if you needed to, for some reason, preserve the data that you had, for example, in that environment, and restore that state of the task or whatever that built-in thing was. So that's something to be aware of, because you will be, like in my experience, when you first build a Dataverse solution, you don't necessarily know all of the things that are built in, but it doesn't take you very long to realize, oh, there's a lot of nice things here and I'd like to use those instead. And so then you're very quickly go into a mode of, well, I'm going to take that thing that's already there and I'm going to adapt it for my purpose. And you know, there may be other dependencies or other ripple effects of the changes that you make to those things that you want to just be aware of. And there is a way to, set it back to the way that it was.
So the last thing I'll say is leveraging managed environments is something that or managed solutions is something that I would try to. It can be painful, but especially if you're dealing with either yourself or other developers where you all have access in production, it is way too tempting to slap on an unmanaged layer on top of a managed layer, or to customize something on top of something in production, and then mess yourself up. So using a managed solution can help with that tremendously. Also limiting who has access in production and test is also another good way to do it. So Jason, if you have something more specific, like I said, ALM is a huge topic. If you looked at, if what we said is like, I kind of know most of that stuff, give us some specifics and we're happy to kind of respond a little bit better.
I think the last thing I'll add there is go look for a tool called the XRM Toolbox. It'll be your best friend, especially if you're managing things, if you're using managed solutions and you need to figure out if there are any unmanaged layers on top that are interfering with the functionality or something like that. There are a number of tools that you can use inside the XRM toolkit that will help you solve those problems and kind of have visibility into that stuff. So that's a great tool that I use a lot.
All right, let's hit pause just for a second. We're about halfway through our time together today. Just wanted to, for anyone new that's joining, you're welcome to drop any questions that you might have in chat. We're here to help for about 30 more minutes. Again, sometimes our questions can get a little bit technical, which is a lot of fun, but we also love the strategy and higher level, more basic questions, and want to encourage those as well. So thanks everyone for being here today. We should go to maybe to one of Aaron's next questions.
Number 2, which is a permission question. So this question is really about managing access and permission for environments, apps, and related data sources. He mentioned security, SharePoint lists, and that he's had some challenges with that. There's also a question about whether or not Azure AD is a viable option to make this a little easier. Much like the previous question about ALM, this can be a complicated question depending on what you are dealing with. The Power Platform permissions work differently for different tools that you're using. You mentioned SharePoint. That is going to be a problem because you have SharePoint permissions, which is data source permissions, and then you have application permissions, which is how you grant access to an application. Groups or security groups can be a way to make this better because you can use security groups in SharePoint to manage permissions, and you can use security groups within your app to manage permissions as well. However, you have to be very careful about how you set that up. And assuming you're talking about Canvas apps, granting someone permissions to the Canvas app is relatively easy. You don't have to be a member of the environment, et cetera, et cetera. If you are mixing in some access to Dataverse data, so a model-driven app or just tables and data within Dataverse, it gets to be more complicated. Users need to be members of the environment before they can get added to permissions. To do that, automatically, not just in time, you've got to have the users directly associated with the group that is the environment security group, or you need to not have an environment security group. There's a whole Teams thing that we could talk about for a little bit, which that you can have them based on Azure Active Directory groups, or you can have them owner, or you can have them, there's a bunch of different things you could go on there. It really depends on what you're trying to do. If I make your assumption that you are dealing with a Canvas app that connects to SharePoint, Active Directory security group is what I would start out with. I would assign that a security group into SharePoint with in a SharePoint group. So either member, owner, or a custom one. And then I would also assign that to the application, and that should be it. That should be good. If there's other data sources that you're concerned with, just mention them. We can probably give some ideas about that.
And if you're jumping into the Dataverse world, Matt, you kind of referred to the different levels of you got to do this and then you got to do this. And the key one there is going to be, well, if you created a model-driven app and you've got custom tables, you're going to need to create some security roles probably and choose what permissions that role
Definitely
has.
Create a custom role. Right. Don't just add those tables to an existing role.
And then you can link either a team, which could be related to an Active Directory security group, to that role. You can assign the role to that team, or you can assign the role to individual users who have been added to your environment because they're a member of the environment's security group. So there are a number of different layers, and it's a crazy matrix.
Yeah, and I would split them up into thinking about it a little bit more. I would probably split it up into two conversations. Do the users of your application need permission to the Power Platform beyond the application? Meaning they're doing something in Dataverse, they're doing something with core tools within the platform, approvals as an example. So yes, I'm using a Canvas app, but I want to use approvals. Guess what? You're technically using Dataverse behind the scenes. And the Canvas app one is fairly it's convoluted a little bit, but it's fairly straightforward. The Dataverse one is extremely complicated, has a lot of nuance to it, and has a lot of power to it.
All right. Next, I think, is Erin M. from YouTube. She had a question about loops and Dataverse choice columns, asking, how can I patch a collection that has the value of the option set and map that to the choice column? And then she added some extra context. Later, she said, I normally would just use a drop-down, but don't know how to apply that for all if the collection column has different values.
Yeah, so there's a lot to read in there. I assume that you're dealing with a Canvas app because you're saying for all, and I assume that you're talking about, I guess you're saying for all loops, so you're saying, for all loop, Dataverse choice column, and then you're saying, hey, how do I patch the collection that has the value of the option set in the map. I'm pretty sure I know how to do that because I have done that before, but I don't have the code in my in my head. But the basic answer is really to worry about generating the data that is required to update it. Which, let me see. We'll go to another question. I know where I can look up how I've done it in the past.
It's be like building a JSON string.
Yeah, largely, but I mean,
okay, we'll move on to. Sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but Usha Priya says, I want to create a ticket from email received to a shared folder, but only for specific emails, which meet certain keywords and not all emails. What are your thoughts on setting this up?
So I'm going to assume when you say shared folder, you mean shared mailbox, or maybe a folder within a shared mailbox. And so if we want to create a ticket from that, I think it would be actually pretty easy to do. So if you have access to the shared mailbox, you should be able to create a Power Automate flow that would trigger based on a new email in that mailbox. And there should be like a filter action or a filter property on that trigger action, or worst case scenario, you can use a trigger condition. And you can look for certain keywords in, for example, the subject line, or even in the body of the email content itself, so that you only pick up on those specific emails. So that's kind of how I would go about it. I don't know. I'm trying to think if I have an example. We're now both in example creation mode.
I have one. I'm not going to create it because I think it'll take too long for what we're doing.
Okay.
But I'll include. This is I had it in my history. This is what I don't have the exact example available to me right off the bat, but I will send a link to. Well, Mitch will have to translate this to YouTube, but this is our option sets are just semicolon separated, as I remember, which is what this implies as well. So you should be able to just take the concatenate the selected items out of your combo box with a comma or semicolons, and it should just work. Hopefully, if it doesn't work, you can email us before the next open office hours, and maybe we can have an example ready for that. But I think it'll be too much work to try to set that up all right now.
I'll just note that I have set up a super simple one that watches my mailbox and forwards receipts to, like, for expenses and whatnot. And so I just have subject filters. The only gotcha that I've found through that is that it's case sensitive for what I needed to filter. So I needed to
cover all the scenarios.
All the scenarios.
Yeah, so if you share my screen real quick, like I've got the action up when a new email arrives in a shared mailbox, and obviously you'll configure this for your shared mailbox address, and then if it was to a specific person or carbon copy or from a specific email address, you can include that here, and it'll pick up on those filters. And then you also have a subject filter, which would be where you might apply your keyword match. So it should be as simple as that, and then the rest of the flow is just creating the ticket wherever you need to create the ticket.
Cool. So, Mitch, I see a number more questions from YouTube. Do you want to go there? Do you want to go back there? I know that we had a few more from, I forgot who it was that was on Teams.
Yep. Yeah, let's do one more from YouTube.
Okay.
Let's do Jason here, and then next we can do Aaron's third question.
Okay. So there's Jason. Actually, I'm going to take Jason's last question because most of the ones we've been doing has been pretty detailed, and we said we wanted to kind of do one that was not. His last question is a little bit more high level, and there is a technical bent to it, but it's basically, is the Power Platform performance adequate for scaling? I think the answer to that question is it depends. Are you a trading company that is going to be,
executing real time?
A microsecond is too long of being able to effectively accomplish a task? If so, Power Platform is not for you. For normal business activity, it is absolutely can scale. this platform is what Dynamics is built on. There's lots of very large companies that are running very large Dynamics implementations with thousands, tens of thousands of users who are using the platform. Yeah, I mean, it's all a question of what you're what your expectations are. At the same time, it is a cloud platform. It is, at the highest level of cloud platform. They can have scenarios where, the platform is bogged down by either an issue in the system or something else going on, right? And it's pretty high level, right? So it could be something that is 5 layers deep that's causing you the problem and making the system to go a little bit slow. But that's fairly infrequent, much like any of the other cloud outages that you might have heard from Azure or Amazon or all of these types of services. It's just kind of what you get with cloud platforms.
It's also it's there. You have to understand the trade-offs, right? You're talking about no code, low code, so it's more cost effective to build an application, but there are trade-offs you're going to have to deal with. So, for example, when Microsoft decides to push an update to controls that maybe don't work that well with your app or for your users, like a very recent one, in my experience, is the date time picker in model-driven apps got updated, and all of a sudden, literally last weekend, it became harder for a user to manually type in or key in a specific time in that field. And so it happened to us, right? And so those are some of the trade-offs, some of the things that you have to deal with. You won't have complete control.
Yeah.
Not only over performance things, but also not necessarily all of the features or user experience elements as well.
The last thing I'll say about performance is Microsoft also has a large number of performance limitations. So this is a shared platform, which means you can't just build a flow that runs a bajillion tasks and actions all at the same time. Like that, you'll get throttled, right? So what'll happen is when you hit that threshold, it'll stop doing your activity until enough time has passed that they say, we'll give you a little bit more bandwidth to basically do something, and then you can do that next thing. That Microsoft's setup explicitly, their intention is to only have that apply to like 1% of their usage scenarios. Their point is the standard license that you purchase should be able to cover you for most things. We've hit it, but only when we're doing something stupid. We went, oh, yeah, that was the easy way to do it, but it wasn't necessarily the best way to do it. All of a sudden, randomly, somebody's doing something, and we hit it, and we go, oh, that was dumb. We should do it better, right? And that was before they significantly increased the capacity that you were allocated. At this point, it's been years since we had a problem with those.
We might be doing stupid things today. We just don't know yet.
Because their number is bigger.
Yeah, and it is a bajillion the actual threshold.
It's big.
Yeah.
Compared to what the average person would do. The other thing I'll tell you, another point about it as well, when you talk about performance, and there's a whole throttling and capacity documentation that we can send you if somebody's interested in it. But the other thing to think about is we talked about those connections. If my account is associated with 100 flows that are all doing a bunch of actions all at the same time, that all counts against my throttling, right? Because it's my user, me personally, right? So you can also add for this connection to a service account that's dedicated to a single one of those flows, and then that one gets its own capacity, right? So it's complicated, but generally speaking, I would have no question. In fact, we've done it for apps that are business critical and will continue to scale over the long haul.
Just says, yeah, sending the capacity document would be great.
Yeah, I can grab that.
All right. We have about 15 minutes left. I think what we have left for questions is from Aaron, as well as Tanya's question. For anyone else that is considering dropping a question, now would be a great time to do it.
So which one we want to start with?
Let's do Aaron's and then Tanya's.
Okay. I developed a mobile app on Power Apps that connects to our ticketing system via custom connector. Okay. The app uses a combination of modern and traditional controls. However, we've experienced an issue with iPhones where selecting a text field results in a zoom in effect. Selecting a text field results in a zoom in effect accompanied by the keyboard. Post text entry, user required to manually zoom out.
So I know this problem in the web development world is that there's a setting, like in the metadata of the HTML, that doesn't allow mobile to zoom in. I don't know how Power Apps handles that.
Well, so one of the questions that I have is like, we're saying we developed a mobile app on Power Apps, which,
Yeah, they just mean the mobile format and mobile.
the mobile layout.
Yeah,
but,
mobile layout.
And Mitch, I'm also thinking about like a recent web experience where the page itself is not developed for mobile, and so when you touch the text input, it zooms way in, and then,
Right.
yeah. But he's saying it's doing it in this scenario, and it's very
But it's
interesting.
doing it most likely because the modern controls. The thing that I would say is modern controls are in preview.
Yeah, true.
Next week they could change. They're not meant for you kind of get what you get at this point. If you have, I think that you have based on what I'm seeing, you probably have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft. You've got 5,000 users. I would imagine you have some sort of EA or something, probably, which should get you some ticket time. I would submit a ticket and be like, hey, like, this is a challenge. It's very likely that they'll go, this preview, just like what I did, and go, yeah, it is what it is. We'll let our developers know that you're concerned about this. But
So one alternative,
that's what I would
if
say.
it's a huge sticking point, and you have to have something more modern, you might take a look. There's a PCF control gallery out there that has a whole bunch of different like controls that are kind of community developed and supported, or maybe even some are individually created. And they have both Canvas app and model-driven app flavors of a variety of different types of inputs. It's obviously like people have run into limitations, and so they've kind of built their own. But you can import those into your environment and then use them in your.
That's even
your app.
more different. He's talking about the PFC gallery, which is not.
No, Mike suggested
I
that.
see.
Oh,
Gallery,
oh,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, the gallery. There's a bunch of them out there that you can kind of search by what type of thing you're trying to do, like if it's a date time field or a calendar or a text field or whatever.
Yeah, the two things I would call out about this though is back to your first question, which was, hey, we've got dev test prod for my 5,000 people. If everyone in the organization is able to dev in your dev environment and you turn on PCF or you turn on, like, that's super risky, right? That means that they could potentially go add their own custom control to do whatever they want, right? These are all things that are reasons for, like, either A, to say, it's cool, we only have 5 developers, we're the developers for our entire organization, that's cool, I can communicate with them, I can turn this on, or no, I need this turned on, I need it a separate way. You mentioned custom connector and you mentioned PCF, and both of those I would go, that sounds like I might want a separate environment so I can really control that, manage that, lock that down, control what's going on with it. But side note, so related to one of your other questions.
All right. Matt's still waiting on that capacity document. If you're still,
I sent
working on
it.
that. Cool.
It's called request limits and allocations. It's you can put it in.
I gotcha. I'll copy it over there.
Yep.
I think Tanya is okay if we don't dive too deep into her question. So let's save that one for the end if we have time. It looks like both Eric and Jason have more questions. Are there any resources that we can point Eric's way that go deeper into this permissions and owners and connections?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there is not one all-encompassing article. I would imagine it would be several hours long and quite convoluted because I was actually on a call this morning, arguing isn't the right word, but having a heated discussion with Microsoft about how something works, and sure enough, their documentation has stuff that says how it really works, but it's like one area that has a box, you know, a purple box in their documentation, and it is Microsoft is troubled by their terms because you've got Microsoft Teams, as I would call it, shared workspaces, and then teams within the Power Platform, and then groups and security groups and Azure Active Directory groups and web and email enabled groups and Office 365. Like, they use the same term for about a bajillion different things, and they all have different functionality. So I don't have one. I can try to come up with my what I would consider to be my list of areas that I would go through from a documentation perspective that's out on Microsoft's site. You know, the reason I would say that is because you said not just the basics. It's a big thing.
So I like one of the things I'm just thinking through some recent stuff that I've done. And if you're thinking about like content that's in SharePoint versus data that's in Dataverse somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And linking those things together. AD security groups is a way to do that. I think the other way that we probably didn't mention or should mention is the ability for you to create a link between a team and the group that's associated with that team. So behind a team is SharePoint.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, which team did you mean?
Yeah. So a Teams team.
Got it.
So behind the Teams team, there's actually a SharePoint site.
Yep.
Right, and that SharePoint site then has
and then you
permissions
have a group,
granted to it based on that Office 365 group, which is associated to the team, and that same group can also be used inside of a Dataverse environment.
Yep.
And linked to a security role or a team, for example, and so then you can actually do the thing that you're trying to do without being an Active Directory admin and creating an Active Directory security group. So that's another way to be able to manage that at a kind of a less deep level, organizationally speaking.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Jason has a question about Power Apps offline.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah. I think the new stuff, like, I haven't done a ton of research into the new stuff. I think the current functionality is not super great. I think the new functionality is supposed to be significantly better. Generally speaking, I try to avoid offline scenarios with Power Apps. That's what I would say about it.
Yeah, I think that's probably okay. Most of this implementation that I've worked on, people have access to the internet. I can think of one project in the last few years where somebody might be on site with a tablet and would need the ability to, perform certain actions or something like that.
With a tablet that might be disconnected.
Might be disconnected, yeah. And at that time, the functionality just wasn't there. So it was really a question of, buy them cellular service.
Well, the other thing is that, like, it does not matter how good your offline capabilities are if you are doing activities to the same thing at the same time where someone's online and somebody's not. You're gonna have problems.
You have a concurrency issue for sure. Yeah.
So a lot of it has to do with designing your application well, such that you can avoid some of those things as well.
Yeah.
If it's just filling out a form and saving some data,
it's easy.
You're in a garage and you can't, sure,
but if I need to
concurrent
get my list of there's people who've talked about I need my list of things that I'm filling out, and I need to be checking boxes and editing this data, but then somebody else is in the other room, they're checking their boxes and they're doing their data.
Or if you need to look up something, search something from a list that has 10,000 rows in it, right, and find that one row, you're not going to download 10,000 things to. I mean, you could, but that's not ideal. So.
Hot take is what I would say, because I also haven't spent a ton of time doing it. Yeah. Like I said, generally speaking, I try to avoid it.
All right, we got about 5 minutes left. I know we have one left from Aaron. I know we have Tanya's question. What are you guys feeling up to?
I don't know. I'm interested in Aaron's last question just because I haven't done that yet.
Yeah, it should be a pretty simple question. So the question he's asking is, the possibility of wrapping a Power App for publication on Android and iOS stores. I've done it. Microsoft has improved their process with this pretty significantly. I've done it in some of the older ways of doing it, and I would tell you it's worth it, but it's work. As I understand the current or new process, it's significantly easier, and I wouldn't have any concerns about doing it, and I would do it.
Is the new wrapper thing, is that a preview or is it full on?
I don't remember. I think it was in preview the last time I looked at it, which was probably 2-3 months ago. I think it is called wrapper. I think that's what they're calling the thing.
Yeah.
But it seemed pretty streamlined. Kind of like honestly, it's kind of I would liken it to a lot of the classic experience versus modern experience, right? Or classic portals versus Power Pages, right? Like it's doing the same thing effectively, but it's way easier to do.
I have a project that's a thing that we want to actually attack upcoming. We just haven't gotten to that thing yet. So
maybe we'll have some more information to provide in that upcoming one.
Yeah. My only note is that in the past, when we've wanted to share Power Apps with employees and we looked at what it looks like in the actual app, the Power Apps app, the experience is pretty poor.
Yes.
Like go here, sign in, go to your list of apps.
Yeah, which is why you want to wrap it. Like if one of your primary modes is mobile, wrapping it is that, like I said, it is whether or not you did it the old way, which was not quite super convenient, or the new way. I think it's 100% worth it. People should do it. Like if that is a primary mode of usage, that definitely is something I would do. But it's work. It's less work now, but it's still work that you got to manage.
I'll say the Power Apps app itself can be confusing, particularly in the ALM type scenario. So if you have the same app in dev, test, and prod, and you want to test them on a mobile device and you're using the Power Apps app, it's like, oh, wait a minute. Which app is dev and which is like, you have to pay attention to make sure that you got the right one.
All right. Jason's throwing a last minute question in here. Thoughts on CDM to fill the time? There's no other questions. Do we have any comments on that?
Specifically common data model. When you
Yes.
say CDM,
Yes.
is that what you mean?
Yes.
So I don't really have any thoughts that I really want to talk about necessarily. I would say that the way that that we have not had the ability to use the common data model across the board ever. So it's not something where I would have a lot of input into.
All right, cool. Well, that brings us about to the end of our time here. Thanks again for everyone joining today. It's always fun to chat with everyone out there. Last minute. Should app makers be developing with Dataverse or SharePoint? Worried about licensing?
Yeah.
Well, there's a few different answers there. So if you're trying to be cheap, and that's the number one thing, you can attempt to use SharePoint, and you can avoid the license costs. If data is really what matters and the model and how you relate your data and structure your data, and you want to build something fast, from a developer standpoint, Dataverse will get you there much faster. Dataverse and model-driven apps specifically will get you there much faster, but you do have a licensing cost to be concerned with. But in the grand scheme of things, if you're building these apps for a business, between the per app license or the pay-as-you-go license, it's truly not that expensive, and it's a monthly expense, and most organizations ought to be able to stomach that or figure that out if the thing that you're building has value. So for me, it always comes down to that. If this thing that you ask me to build really is that important to your organization, well, might it be worth $6 a month per user to use it? So that's kind of what I look at, but definitely I like Dataverse for building data first apps quickly. So.
All right, last thing I want to do is invite people to an upcoming event that we have. Matt here and Emma, who you have heard from before, are hosting a webinar coming up in the end of July here. It's all about how to streamline your internal communication at your work. So if you're part of your job is helping with communication internally and making sure employees are all on the same page and all rowing together, it would be a great one for you to join. So I wanted to share that with you all. I'm dropping it in chat here. Otherwise, we will be back next month for office hours, and we'll see some of you there.
So I have two things I want to say about two other questions that I want to make sure that we're clear on. So the developing with Dataverse for SharePoint, I agree with Mike 100%. Dataverse is the preferred method if you're actually developing an app. If you're just doing something else, SharePoint or something else is fine. You asked a question at the last second. Per app, does that include everything in the solution? No. Per app, per user gets you one app and one portal solution or portal Power Apps Pages or Power Apps Portal app for your license.
Thanks, Matt.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon. All right, you're off audio. I'm doing the wide shot of the video.
Wish I could respond to Jason on chat. Should have stopped on the video.
Well, he's the one that knows my purchase, so. Just the tip, though.
Yeah, but I want you to understand that we have not put these on data model, but on data model is everything. Like all of the yeah.
Okay, you're off video.
Yeah,
Like I kind of wish you would have said something about it because you probably
I've
have
been
way
working
more.
with it, yeah.
I haven't. So.
oh, we didn't answer Tony's question.
We didn't get to it at all. I would have rather done that one than the CDM one. Which I was trying, one of the reasons I was fumbling around with that was I was like, that's the one I would rather talk about than that one.
You picked it.
No, I did.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
You picked it?
And then I
Yeah.
felt, and then I didn't know what
Oh.
CDM was, so then I felt like I needed to ask, and then once I asked, and I got confirmation that that's what it was, I felt like I had to answer something, and then I was like,
I just say I don't know much about that, honestly. That's what we tell our clients, right? I don't know. Yeah. That's an okay answer.
I mean, it's, yes.
I don't know. I talked to him. It was really right.
Then why did you say something?
Because I had never heard of it referred to as the CDM.
Same with me, that's the, but yes.
Yeah, I had the same problem.
But CDM, but the real deal is, it is more than just the out-of-the-box